Hi students, welcome to Year 9 Science and Unit 2 on Our Amazing Earth. In this particular video we're going to look at some of the evidence for Wegener's idea about continental drift. What we need to do is to ensure that we've got a couple of pieces of evidence that will help support this idea of Wegener's about continental drift. One of the important things at this stage is we're not looking at the mechanism, we're not trying to explain why this occurred, we're simply looking at the idea and whether or not there's any scientific basis for the conclusions that Alfred Wegener made. So he actually used two very important pieces of evidence in order to help support his theory. The first of those was the shape of the continents, and we've already had a quick look at that in terms of the jigsaw fit. And I guess the reality is this is most easily seen for the continents of South America and Africa. And in a previous video, we looked at the supercontinent of Pangaea and the fact that those two continents in particular seem to have unusual shapes and yet seem to fit quite closely together. So that whole idea of the different variable shapes of the continents and the fact that they seem to sit nicely together was one little piece of evidence that Wegener used. The other was the distribution of rocks and fossils. Now he started to look at rocks and fossils in a little bit more detail, particularly some different types of fossils, to see A, what sort of environment they would be most likely to live in, and B, how he could explain the fact that some of these organisms seem to occur in rocks that were a long way apart from one another, with no obvious way for the organisms involved to be able to move from one place to another. So I guess the first thing we want to do is have a little bit more of a look at this idea of the jigsaw fit. And as I mentioned in a previous video, Wegener wasn't the first scientist to notice this, but certainly he's probably the most famous. Antonio Pellegrini, probably 50, 60 years before Wegener, had the same idea. He noticed the shape of South America and Africa, and actually drew maps showing them close together and further apart. And that was in the late 1850s. So this idea was quite an old one. Edward Suez also proposed some linkage between the different continents, although his idea was more about land bridges between the various continents and the mechanisms by which organisms could move from one continent to another. But the thing with Wegener is he started to try and draw on evidence. As a good scientist, and if we want to teach you good scientific practice, then what we want you to do is to argue a position using evidence. So we want you to collect evidence. Yes, it might be evidence that supports your position, but that's still important as long as it's actual evidence that other people can look at, can sift through. Perhaps they may come to different conclusions that you do, but at least that you're basing your opinions on some evidence that you've collected. So here, for example, is a map of what we now call Gondwana, which was the southern supercontinent. So this was a result of the breakup of what we called Pangaea, which is the all of the continents originally joined together into a northern group and a southern group, and the southern group included Australia, Antarctica, as well as South America and Africa, and also India and Madagascar. And these are some interesting little additions that we have here. And you can even see Sri Lanka is identified in this particular map. So this was the first very important piece of evidence that Wegener put forward to help support his idea of continental drift, was the whole idea of this jigsaw fit. So if you are identifying the jigsaw fit of continents, and you know that what that means is that the shapes of these different continents is such that it looks like they could have actually been stuck back together at some point in the distant past and subsequently have moved apart. Then you've got an idea of the first area of evidence that Wegener introduced. The second piece of evidence that he based continental drift on was the idea of rock and fossil distributions. So he looked at rock types, had some understanding of the rock cycle and how different rock types are formed. So he knew about igneous, and he knew about sedimentary, and he knew about metamorphic, and how each of these can be changed one into another, and so on. So he had some idea about how different rocks formed, and therefore he was a little bit surprised at the formation of certain types of rocks that looked very similar in terms of their composition, and yet were a very long way away from one another, and yet corresponded in age. But he also had a look at fossils. And interestingly enough, the map here shows the distribution of some quite interesting fossils that give us questions about how this could have been given the current position of each of these particular continents. So if you think about the fact that South America and Africa are separated by a very large ocean, then you can see from the little diagram that there is an orange mark here, this one here, and this is a Triassic reptile called Lystrosaurus. We also have a couple of other Triassic reptiles. These are represented by the blue and also the brown. And you can see each of these reptiles are ones that are not particularly going to be good swimmers, certainly not sufficient for them to cover great distances in the oceans, and a couple of whom are really more suited to life on land. So how they would have made it from South America to Africa to India to Antarctica, which we now know is at the South Pole and is extraordinarily cold, and one group which are plants which I haven't talked about yet, which made it to Australia as well. How all of this could have happened with all of the continents being in their current position seemed rather unusual. So an explanation for this distribution was that originally all of these continents were very close together. There may well have been land bridges, differences in sea level, or continents that were close enough together so that there was actually a land link between them, in order for organisms like reptiles to plod from one place to another, and therefore have a reasonable distribution on two continents that are now widely separated. One of the really interesting ones, and one of the ones that I guess is important for us in Australia, is Glossopteris. Glossopteris is a beautiful plant, and the fossils that are produced are extremely colourful, and you can see a little sample on this slide. This particular species has a huge distribution, what we might call a Gondwanan distribution, because we pretty much find it in the rocks of all of the continents that were once part of Gondwana, assuming that we accept continental drift. So this provides very strong evidence to support this idea that the continents were originally stuck together and then drifted apart at some point in the past in order to be in their current geographical positions today. You can see the green mark, which is the distribution of Glossopteris, is pretty much everywhere across all of these continents. Now, it's a plant, so it can't get up and walk anywhere. It can be distributed by the wind, but certainly we wouldn't expect it to be distributed the sorts of distances that we find in this distribution. So this was Wegener's second area of evidence. His first area of evidence was the shape of the continents and the jigsaw fit. The second area of evidence was the types of fossils and rocks that were found in different Gondwanan continents, and the fact that the distributions of those, where they were found, certainly suggests that they must have been joined at some point. And not only that, that certainly something like Antarctica had very different climate to what it currently has. So there's a few little pieces of evidence in there that support this idea of vagueness. Here's a summary list of all of these things that I've just briefly talked about, and it's important to keep track of each of these. I think it's a good way that you start to build up some of the areas of evidence around continental drift. So we've talked about the jigsaw fit, and we've talked about the fact that there are similar rock types and the ages of those rocks being around the Triassic. For some of those reptile fossils that we were looking at, means that when those rocks formed, they formed at the same time on all these different parts, continents of the world. Suggests that maybe they formed at about the same time. The fact that they also have similar fossils, that identifies the type of ecosystems that were present at the time, the sorts of plants and animals that were present, and we can infer some relationships between those. We didn't talk about all of the reptiles that were found. Mesosaurs were one of those groups, and of course the Glossopteris ferns as well. The other thing with the distributions, as we saw with Antarctica, is Antarctica currently has a climate that's very unsuited to tropical or temperate plants or animals, and certainly we find some of those in the rocks in Antarctica. We've also seen some coal deposits, which again tend to occur or tend to correspond to tropical environments, and we find them in temperate or polar regions. Limestone deposits that are similar between Australia, Antarctica and South Africa, and also some glacial scarring. And if you sometimes can see diagrams which show almost a little band of glacial scarring that actually covers parts of each of those continents in a nice organized pattern. So there's lots of different evidence that supports this idea of vagueness of continental drift. But the problem with continental drift is, whilst it looked like a good idea, Wegener didn't have a mechanism. He didn't have an idea about how the continents were actually able to move from one place to another. And we're talking about huge, massive blocks of rock. So how did that occur? Well, that's a problem that we're going to look at in the next video. Thanks for watching.